The soft, dim glow of chandeliers flickered above the polished marble floors, casting a golden hue across the Arcadian table, a renowned fine dining restaurant nestled in the heart of Beverly Hills. It was a place of understated luxury where the chatter of well-dressed patrons blended seamlessly with the hum of impeccable service. The scent of aged wine and truffle oil drifted through the air, mingling with the sounds of forks and knives lightly tapping against plates. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was an experience, a symbol of class and sophistication that was almost intangible. In this space, every detail was meticulously crafted to evoke a sense of privilege, but without the boastfulness that usually accompanied such an elite environment. Ethan, a young waiter in his late 20s, moved between the tables with practiced ease. His white shirt clung to his frame, damp with the effort of a busy evening. The restaurant, a haven for film producers, fashion moguls, and business tycoons, had seen its fair share of high-profile clientele, and Ethan had long since grown accustomed to serving these elite patrons. He was used to the quiet dignity that came with this world, where wealth and influence had their own language, one spoken not through words but through subtle gestures, silent nods, and exchanged glances. As he weaved through the maze of tables, his attention was caught by a particular scene in the far corner of the room. A teenage boy sat with an older man, engrossed in their conversation. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, tall, gangly, and sporting a quiet air of self-assurance. But what truly caught Ethan's eye was the red MAGA hat sitting atop the boy's head, stark against the muted elegance of the room. It was so out of place, almost jarring, like a bright spot in an otherwise carefully curated setting. Ethan's irritation flared as he glanced at the hat. It wasn't just a piece of headwear to him. It was a statement, a political symbol that, in his mind, represented everything he disliked. His coworkers often teased him about his fiery opinions, and he prided himself on speaking his mind. This, however, felt different. His pulse quickened, and he couldn't help but mutter under his breath as he grabbed a pitcher of water. He steeled himself, determined to make a point. Tonight, the hat symbolized something he had no interest in engaging with, and he intended to show it. As he approached the table, the older man glanced up, offering a polite nod. The boy, however, didn't look up from his phone. Ethan set the water glasses down a bit more forcefully than he intended, the sound loud enough to momentarily disrupt the hum of conversation around them. "What can I get for you tonight?" he asked, his voice sharp. Before the older man could respond, Ethan added, "Or does he," he gestured towards the boy, "prefer to be served elsewhere, given the hat?" The room seemed to pause. The boy slowly raised his head, meeting Ethan's gaze for the first time. His expression was unreadable. He didn't respond immediately, instead giving a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the older man. With a quiet authority, the man placed their order, completely ignoring Ethan's comment. Ethan's chest tightened with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The boy's silence unsettled him. It was almost as if the words hadn't affected him at all, or worse, they hadn't mattered. Ethan walked away, but the weight of the encounter lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about the moment had shifted the atmosphere in the room. It was subtle but undeniable. Just as Ethan began to calm his racing thoughts, the manager appeared at his side, his face set in an unreadable expression. He whispered something that made Ethan's heart drop to his stomach. "That boy," the manager whispered urgently, "is Barron Trump." The words hung in the air, heavier than any dish or wine they served. The manager's voice carried a note of panic as he continued. "And the man with him is Senator Alden Royce. They're here after a high-profile charity event." Ethan felt his face go pale. Barron Trump. The name struck him like a thunderclap. The gravity of the situation settled in his chest like an anchor. How could he have been so careless? "What were you thinking?" the manager hissed, his voice sharp with reprimand. The moment felt like it was stretching, every second stretched thin under the pressure. "You have no idea what kind of trouble this could bring." "I didn't," Ethan stammered, but his voice trailed off, hollow with the realization of the magnitude of his mistake. His gaze flickered back to the table where Barron sat, calm and composed, his expression unreadable. There was no anger, no immediate retaliation. The quiet strength of the boy unnerved him more than any outburst ever could. The manager's glare was cutting as he walked away, leaving Ethan standing there in a daze, heart pounding, feeling the weight of the room's attention. It was subtle, glances from diners, the barely perceptible shift in the ambience. But it was enough to make Ethan painfully aware of just how far his actions had gone. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself glancing nervously at the corner table. The older man, Senator Royce, seemed at ease, his voice low and calm as he spoke to Barron, who responded with a faint smile. The boy's composure, his calmness in the face of an insult, disturbed Ethan more than he cared to admit. The silence between them hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Finally, Senator Royce motioned for the bill. Ethan hesitated, rooted to the spot as the manager gave him a sharp nod. This was his moment to make amends, or at least attempt to. He approached the table, trying to steady his shaking hands. Senator Royce looked up with a faint smile. "Thank you for your service tonight," he said, his tone courteous, but there was no mistaking the disapproval woven into his words. Ethan's eyes flickered to Barron, who met his gaze for the first time. His face was calm, but there was something in his expression, something that suggested he wasn't interested in the apology that Ethan fumbled over. Ethan managed to stammer out a mumbled apology, but it felt hollow, empty in the face of the weight of what had transpired. Barron didn't say a word. He simply stood, placed the MAGA hat back on his head, and followed Senator Royce out of the restaurant, leaving behind an oppressive silence. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the room seemed to dissolve, but Ethan's stomach churned with a gnawing sense of dread. He had made a mistake, a big one, and it wasn't over yet. The restaurant began to settle back into its usual rhythm, but Ethan felt disconnected from it all. He wandered aimlessly behind the bar, unable to shake the weight of his blunder. The oppressive silence from the corner table lingered, and it gnawed at him. In the back of his mind, he replayed the scene over and over. His comment, the boy's silence, the disapproving glances of the other diners. The realization was beginning to hit him harder than he expected. This wasn't just a mistake, it was something much bigger. The discomfort he felt now wasn't just due to the mistake. It was the awareness that his own biases had gotten in the way of his professionalism. And now, it was too late to take back his words. A few minutes passed before the restaurant manager reappeared, his face a mix of frustration and quiet disbelief. "Ethan," he began, his voice sharp, "I can't believe what just happened. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The words felt like daggers. The Trump family, for better or worse, has influence. And now, this will be everywhere. This could ruin us. Ethan felt his heart drop. He couldn't believe the weight of the situation. Everything had been going smoothly until tonight. Until that moment of judgment, that spark of irritation that had clouded his better judgment. And now, he was facing the aftermath. As the manager continued to pace, his words only sank deeper into Ethan's consciousness. The magnitude of what he had done was growing clearer by the minute, and the implications were becoming terrifyingly real. The manager wasn't finished. "Do you realize how bad this looks for us? For you? Barron Trump, the senator, the connections they have, the influence they wield. This isn't just a slip-up. This is a public relations nightmare, and you've thrown us right into it. We'll have to apologize. Get ahead of this, or it could cost us everything." The manager's voice was tinged with anger, but there was also fear. Fear that Ethan's one ill-considered remark could bring the restaurant into a firestorm. Ethan was still in shock, and it wasn't until the manager left, storming off in frustration, that he allowed himself to breathe again. He took a moment to look around the room, observing the other patrons, who now seemed to be watching him more closely. He could feel the subtle shifts of attention as some discreetly glanced his way, their phones seemingly aimed at him. The evening, which had been busy but manageable, now felt suffocating. The walls of the restaurant, once a sanctuary, now felt like they were closing in. His palms were sweaty, his mouth dry, and his thoughts were racing faster than he could control. With trembling hands, Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. A quick search confirmed his worst fear. Posts were already spreading across social media, and the narrative was quickly taking shape. Waiter insults Barron Trump over MAGA hat at Arcadian table was the headline of the first post he saw. The photo attached showed him mid-sentence, his face twisted in an expression of irritation, captured at exactly the wrong moment. Ethan felt his stomach churn as he scrolled down, reading the comments that followed. Some were calling him a hero for standing up to privilege, while others were quick to condemn him, labeling him as rude, insensitive, and even accusing him of bullying a teenager for his family's politics. Ethan dropped his phone back into his pocket with a shaky breath, his chest tight with a mix of guilt and panic. This was only going to get worse. The manager's words rang in his ears. The Trumps had connections. And what if they used those connections against him? What if this ruined not just his job but his entire reputation? The night dragged on in slow motion. Every time Ethan walked past a table, he felt eyes on him, and each glance seemed to carry judgment. It was a feeling that made him want to disappear into the walls. The meal service, usually his escape, was now just another reminder of the monumental misstep he had made. When the restaurant finally began to empty out, Ethan found himself in the staff room, sitting on the edge of a couch, staring at the glowing screen of his phone. His hands trembled as he refreshed the social media feed, watching the storm of posts and comments grow with every passing minute. The photo of him, his face twisted in apparent anger, was everywhere. Some called for his firing, others demanded an apology from the restaurant. The conversation was spreading beyond just the restaurant. It was becoming political, a part of a larger national debate over symbols, political affiliations, and the assumptions people made based on those symbols. Ethan's phone buzzed, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from an unfamiliar number, but the name attached made his blood run cold. Alden Royce, the senator. He had a message for Ethan. Meet me tomorrow at 11 a.m. The boy deserves to be heard. Ethan froze. His heart pounded as he read the words again, unable to fully comprehend their meaning. An invitation? To what? A confrontation? A chance to explain himself? He couldn't be sure. All he knew was that he was going to have to face the consequences of his actions. But what would that meeting entail? Was it an opportunity for redemption? Or was it something far more serious? The possibilities rushed through his mind, each one worse than the last. The hours between then and the meeting felt like an eternity. Ethan tossed and turned that night, his mind racing with scenarios of how the meeting might go. Was he going to have to beg for forgiveness? Would Barron Trump himself confront him? And how could he possibly explain or justify what he had said? He couldn't. He could only take responsibility and hope that somehow he could make things right. The following morning, Ethan arrived at the Arcadian table an hour early. The usual hum of activity in the restaurant was gone. Without the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation, the place felt cold, distant. He stood alone in the dining room, pacing back and forth as he rehearsed what he would say, but each attempt at an apology felt insufficient. What could he say to undo the damage? Nothing he said could take back the hurtful words. At exactly 11 a.m., the door to the restaurant opened, and Ethan's heart stopped. There they were, Senator Alden Royce, standing tall and composed, and beside him, Barron Trump. Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. The boy was just as he had been the night before, calm, collected, and silent. His MAGA hat was nowhere to be seen, but the quiet strength he exuded seemed just as powerful, if not more so. Senator Royce gestured for Ethan to sit, and without a word, Ethan took a seat, his mind racing. There was no going back now. He had to face the consequences. Ethan sat at the table, his heart pounding in his chest. The room felt unnaturally quiet, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Barron Trump, the teenager who had been at the center of the storm, sat across from him, his expression unreadable. The senator, Alden Royce, sat next to him, his gaze steady and calm, as though he had seen this kind of thing 100 times before. Ethan couldn't help but feel like a child being scolded, even though no words had been exchanged yet. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Ethan's mind raced, trying to figure out what to say. He had never been good at apologizing, not because he didn't want to, but because the words always felt inadequate, like they could never fully convey the remorse he felt. This time, though, It wasn't just about an apology. It was about understanding the depth of what he had done, about coming face to face with the consequences of his actions, and about trying to learn and grow from the experience. Finally, the senator broke the silence. His voice was calm, measured, as though he had prepared for this moment. Ethan, what you said last night was inappropriate. No one here is going to pretend otherwise. But I believe in handling things face to face, rather than through social media or public apologies. So we're here now, giving you the opportunity to understand the full scope of what you've done. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just nodded again, waiting for the senator to continue. The thing about what you did, Ethan, the senator continued, is that it wasn't just about the hat. It was about the assumptions you made based on something you saw. You looked at that hat and made a judgment, and that judgment was shaped by your personal feelings, your biases. And that's the problem. Ethan felt the heat rise in his cheeks. He had already realized this, but hearing the senator put it into words made it feel even more real. The senator was right. He had made a judgment about Barron based on something as trivial as a hat. He hadn't bothered to consider who the boy was, what he believed, or why he wore the hat in the first place. All he had seen was a symbol that irritated him, and he had let that dictate his behavior. The senator paused, letting his words sink in. Then he turned to Barron, who had been quietly watching Ethan the entire time. Barron, do you want to say anything? For the first time since he had entered the restaurant, Barron spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm for a teenager, but there was an undeniable maturity in the way he carried himself. I understand why you made the comment, Ethan, he said, his tone steady. I've seen it before. People see the hat, and they think they know everything about me. But they don't. They don't know why I wear it. They don't know me. Ethan felt a wave of guilt wash over him. The boy, no, the young man, was right. He hadn't taken the time to understand Barron, or to think about why he wore the hat. He had let his own frustrations and biases cloud his judgment, and it had led to this moment. He felt small in that moment, the weight of his own ignorance pressing heavily on him. I'm sorry, Ethan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I shouldn't have said what I did. I was wrong. I judged you without knowing anything about you. I should have asked, instead of assuming, and for that, I'm truly sorry. Barron didn't say anything immediately. He simply looked at Ethan, his expression unreadable. Ethan couldn't tell if the apology had been accepted, or if it had even made a difference. But then, after a moment, Barron spoke again. You're not the first person to make a comment like that, he said, and you won't be the last. People see the hat, and they assume they know everything about me. But here's the thing. There's more to me than just a hat. Just like there's more to you than your opinions about politics. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Barron's words. The boy was wise beyond his years, and Ethan realized just how much he had underestimated him. He had judged Barron, not based on who he was as a person, but based on an outward symbol. And in doing so, he had missed the opportunity to understand him. Barron's voice softened slightly. It's not just about the hat, though. It's about how people see you and the assumptions they make. And the hardest part is realizing that no matter what you say or do, some people will still only see the mistake. They won't care about the reasons behind it. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He understood now. The mistake wasn't just in what he had said, but in the assumptions he had made. And even if he apologized, there would always be people who saw him as a villain in this story. It wasn't fair, but it was the reality he had to accept. The senator leaned forward, his gaze steady. Ethan, what matters now is not just your apology, but how you move forward. You've been given a chance to reflect on your actions. What are you going to do with that? Ethan thought about the question for a moment. He had already apologized, but that wasn't enough. He needed to do better, to be better. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could change how he responded to it. He could learn from his mistake and try to be more open-minded in the future. He could make a conscious effort to challenge his own biases and to see people for who they really were, not just for what they wore or what they represented. I want to do better, Ethan said, his voice steady. I don't want to judge people based on assumptions anymore. I want to take the time to understand them to listen to their stories before jumping to conclusions. Barron gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That's a good start. As the meeting came to a close, Ethan felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. He still had a lot of work to do to change the way he saw the world. But this meeting, this conversation, had been the first step, and for the first time since the incident, he felt like there might be hope for redemption. Barron and the senator stood up to leave. Before Barron walked out the door, he turned to Ethan one last time. Remember, it's not just about saying you'll do better. It's about showing it through your actions. You have to prove it. Ethan watched them leave, the door closing behind them with a quiet finality. He sat there for a moment, taking in the gravity of the conversation. The lesson had been harsh, but necessary. And as he thought about it, he realized that this was the moment that would define who he would become. When the manager entered the room, his expression softened somewhat. "How did it go?" he asked. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Better than I deserved," he said quietly. The manager nodded. "Good. Just remember, it's not about what happened. It's about what you do next." Ethan nodded, his resolve firming up. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to take the first steps toward becoming a better person. And he knew that with each step, he would grow, not just professionally, but personally as well.